There are two fundamental truths in Whispering Pines, the master-planned community I'd regrettably begun to call home. 1. All exterior paint must be chosen from a palette of colors so bland they could induce a coma. We're talking exciting ecru, thrilling taupe, or my personal favorite, basically beige. 2. You do not, under any circumstances, mess with a man's automated lawn care. It's the suburban equivalent of slapping a dueling glove across someone's face. Carol, the self-appointed guardian of our community's soul-crushing conformity, had just gleefully and catastrophically violated that second truth. She was about to discover that while she was the queen of petty bylaws, I was the king of disproportionate responses. She was about to find out why my welcome mat says, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. I stood at my expansive living room window, tablet in hand, a look of what I can only describe as grim satisfaction etched onto my face. The mid-afternoon Arizona sun beat down relentlessly, making the very air shimmer above the asphalt. It was 107 degrees in the shade, assuming you could find any. Through the pristine, double-paned glass, I saw her. Carol. She was on her porch, hands planted firmly on her hips, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across her face. Her property was a testament to beige supremacy, but her garden was an explosion of prize-winning petunias, each one a vibrant, mocking jewel in her crown of suburban tyranny. She knew what she'd done, and she knew that I knew. You wanted the sprinklers off, Carol, I muttered to the empty room, the condensation from my glass of iced tea dripping onto the cool granite of the windowsill. Fine, but you see, I have contingencies. My gaze dropped to the tablet cradled in my other hand. It wasn't running Netflix or checking stocks. It was open to a custom-made control interface, an app I'd spent the better part of a month coding myself. The design was minimalist, clean, with one glorious exception. Dead center on the screen was a large digital button, glowing an ominous, tempting red. The label beneath it was simple, elegant, and packed with more potential energy than a supernova. Wildfire suppression, full deployment. I'd watched her do it on the high-res security feed just moments before. My cameras, another unapproved aesthetic modification she'd written me up for, had captured the whole sordid affair in glorious 4K. A quick, furtive lean over the low, decorative fence separating our properties. A triumphant little glint of sunlight off her favorite pair of gardening shears. And then, a decisive snip. My primary sprinkler system's control wire was history. That was 2 minutes ago. 2 minutes. The exact amount of time it takes to walk from the side of my house back to my living room, pull up a specific app, and contemplate the awesome power one has so foolishly been dared to unleash. It was the precise interval required to transition from mildly irritated homeowner to architect of a localized meteorological event. I looked back at Carol. She was now theatrically pointing at one of my wilting flower beds near the property line, no doubt composing another scathing email to the HOA board in her head. She gave a little shake of her head, a pantomime of disappointment. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Let's see how your precious petunias handle 500 gallons of reclaimed water per minute, I whispered, the words feeling electric in the quiet house. I gave a final theatrical sigh, a little, "What can you do?" shrug for an audience of one, and with a slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying tap, I pressed the glowing red button. For a single, beautiful second, nothing happened. Then, a low, deep hum began to vibrate up through the floorboards, a promise of the chaos to come. Look, I know what you're thinking. Overkill, right? A sledgehammer to kill a fly. And you're not wrong. But to understand the flood, You have to understand the soul-crushing drought of common sense that preceded it. Even monsters have an origin story, and mine is paved with beige stucco and passive-aggressive newsletters. My journey into suburban villainy began, as most do, with a mailbox. I'd moved into Whispering Pines a year ago. I work from home as a software engineer, and the house was perfect. It was modern, spacious, and most importantly, it backed onto a vast, undeveloped canyon preserve. The peace and quiet, I thought, would be magnificent. I was young, naive, and hadn't yet been introduced to the Homeowners Association, which operated less like a neighborhood committee and more like a miniature totalitarian regime. Carol was its chief enforcer. My first sin was the mailbox. I'd ordered a sleek, minimalist piece of brushed steel online. It was modern, understated, and, as I would soon learn, 1 inch taller than the maximum height stipulated in Bylaw 14, Section C, Paragraph 2, Approved Mail Receptacle Dimensions. The first notice appeared taped to my front door, sealed in a Ziploc bag to protect it from the morning dew, a level of care I found deeply unsettling. It was a polite but firm warning. I, being a reasonable person, figured I'd just lower it an inch on the weekend, but I got busy. A week later, a second notice arrived, this time in the mailbox itself. The tone had shifted from firm to frosty. It mentioned potential daily fines. The third notice was hand-delivered by Carol herself. She caught me taking out the recycling. "Mr. Henderson," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension, "we've sent 2 notices regarding your non-compliant mail receptacle." "Hi, Carol. Call me Jack. Yeah, sorry about that. Been swamped with work. I'll get to it." "The bylaws," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken, "are the very threads that weave the tapestry of our community's visual harmony. If we allow a 1-inch deviation on mailboxes, what's next?" She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes scanning the neighborhood as if searching for impending signs of blight. People painting their doors unapproved shades of blue? Lawn flamingos? It's a slippery slope to chaos. "Carol, it's a box for letters," I'd replied, already exhausted. "My mail carrier, a lovely woman named Brenda, has no issue with its altitude. Are we really going to form a committee over 2.54 centimeters? Because if we are, I'd like to formally submit Dave's Army of Garden Gnomes down the street for review. I'm pretty sure staring blankly into my kitchen window all day violates some sort of aesthetic code." That was my second sin: sarcasm. Carol did not appreciate sarcasm. The next day I received a formal fine notification for $25. I lowered the mailbox that afternoon, but the battle lines had been drawn. Then came the great trash can transgression. I was on a critical 9-hour call for a project launch. The kind where you barely have time to breathe, let alone monitor the precise location of your municipal waste containers. I forgot to bring the bins in from the curb. I remembered at about 8 p.m. and rushed out to retrieve them, only to find a laminated 30-point font violation notice zip-tied to the handle of my recycling bin. The next morning, the entire neighborhood received a Community Watch Alert email from Carol. Subject: Flagrant disregard for sanitation protocols. Attached was a photo, a grainy, zoomed-in shot taken from across the street, of my offending bins, my bins. She made it sound like I was operating a rogue landfill and attracting vermin from 3 counties. I left a trash can out. In her world, this was apparently a crime on par with treason. But my feud with Carol was just the appetizer. The main course, the reason I turned my backyard into a miniature water park, was the canyon. And the fire. Last summer, a wildfire had sparked in the preserve during a dry lightning storm. For 3 days, we watched it crawl along the canyon ridge. The smoke was a thick, acrid blanket that choked the sky, and turned the sun into a tiny blood-red coin. Ash, like morbid gray snow, coated everything. At night, the horizon glowed with a terrifying, mesmerizing orange. I stood on my back patio, the heat palpable on my face, and experienced a feeling of profound, gut-wrenching helplessness. I packed a go-bag with my laptop, hard drives, and a change of clothes, realizing with a sick certainty that everything else I owned could be vaporized within the hour. The official response was stretched thin, and the fire crews were battling blazes all over the state. It was a sudden, miraculous change in the wind, not a fire hose, that ultimately saved Whispering Pines from becoming Whispering Cinders. That experience changed me. It recalibrated my sense of priority. While the HOA was busy debating the acceptable shade of taupe for trim, I was thinking about defensible space and BTUs. I decided with absolute clarity that I would never be that helpless again. Which led me to Gus. I found his company, A-Team Fire Suppression, after weeks of research. They normally handled commercial projects, server farms, industrial parks, doomsday prepper compounds in Montana. I called him for a consultation. Gus was a man forged from steel, skepticism, and chewing tobacco. He arrived in a dusty Ford F-250, looked at my pleasant suburban house, then at me, then at the canyon. "Okay, let me get this straight," he said, stroking a beard that had probably seen more action than most soldiers. "You want the Wildfire Defense Perimeter System, the one we normally quote for protecting vital infrastructure and paranoid billionaires, for your 3-bedroom house?" "That's the one," I confirmed. "I want to be able to create a Category 5 hurricane in a 100-foot radius with the press of a button. Think biblical deluge, but with better water pressure and significantly fewer locusts." Gus stared at me for a long moment, then a slow grin spread across his leathery face. "It's gonna be loud," he said. "Messy as all hell. And your neighbors are gonna think the world is ending." "Gus, my man," I replied, grinning back. "That's not a bug, that's a feature." The installation was a thing of beauty. His crew was a team of professionals who descended on my property with trenchers, backhoes, and a palpable sense of glee. This wasn't another boring warehouse job. This was fun. They dug a massive hole in my backyard for the 10,000-gallon reclaimed water tank, laying high-pressure pipes around the entire perimeter of my lot. The sprinkler heads themselves were marvels of engineering, industrial-sized brass and steel nozzles designed to pop up from concealed underground housings. Of course, Carol watched the entire process from her window, her face a storm cloud of suspicion. The moment the first trench was dug, she was on the phone to the HOA, the city, probably the governor. She tried to get the project shut down, citing a dozen different bylaws about unapproved landscape modifications and major construction. This was where I had her beat. Before Gus ever broke ground, I had spent 2 months with a lawyer, navigating the city's permitting process. Because the system was classified as a wildfire safety installation, it was not only permitted but encouraged by the city, especially for properties bordering the canyon. My permits were ironclad, and they completely superseded the HOA's petty authority. I had them laminated. When Carol confronted me on my lawn, waving a copy of the HOA rulebook, I calmly handed her a copy of my city-issued construction permit. The look on her face, a mixture of rage, frustration, and impotence, was the moment our Cold War turned hot. She couldn't stop my project, so she decided to make my life miserable in every other way she could. The mailbox, the trash cans, complaining about the noise from my air conditioner, the glare from my security lights. It was a relentless campaign of petty harassment. And it all led to last Saturday, which brings us back to the day that will live in infamy or at least in the Whispering Pines Community Forum for the next decade. The sun was hot enough to melt the tires off a car, and the latest HOA newsletter had just landed in my inbox. The headline: Petunia of the Month, a celebration of Carol's Corolla. I swear you can't make this stuff up. The universe was clearly setting the stage for a tragicomedy of epic proportions. My first inkling that something was amiss came around 2 p.m. I was in my garage, which I'd insulated and air-conditioned into a passable man cave, tinkering with a vintage motorcycle. I had my regular, polite, everyday sprinklers set to run for 20 minutes in the afternoon to keep my lawn from turning into a pile of straw. I happened to glance at the control panel. The active zone light was off. That was weird. The system was as reliable as the sunrise. I walked outside. The concrete was bone dry. My prized hydrangeas, a vibrant, rebellious blue specifically chosen to offend Carol's beige sensibilities, were starting to wilt dramatically, their heavy heads drooping in the oppressive heat. They were my canaries in the coal mine of lawn hydration. If they were sad, something was wrong. I went back to the control panel. I tried to run a manual cycle. Nothing. The screen was on, but it was like the signal was getting lost somewhere between the garage and the valves. I checked the breaker. It was fine. I'm not exactly Sherlock Holmes, but the clues were pointing in one very obvious petunia-loving direction. Motive? Carol had been complaining for a week that my excessive but necessary watering schedule was causing a microscopic amount of runoff to dampen the delicate pH balance of her precious petunia soil. She claimed it was causing petal discoloration. Weapon. She was famously attached to a pair of razor-sharp gardening shears, the ones she used to meticulously deadhead her floral minions. I'd seen her sharpening them with a kind of focused glee that was frankly disturbing. Opportunity. The main control valve box for the entire system was located on the side of my house, tucked behind a bush, right next to the low decorative fence that separated our properties. It was an open and shut case for the Jack Henderson Bureau of Are You Kidding Me? Investigations. To be sure, I went back to my office and pulled up the live feed from my security cameras. Another one of my unapproved additions. I'd installed them after finding mysterious footprints in my flower beds. I scrolled back the timeline on the DVR footage. 1 hour? Nothing. An hour and a half? Nothing. Then, at the 1 hour and 45-minute mark, bingo. There she was. The footage was so clear it was almost cinematic. Carol, clad in a massive sun hat and beige gardening gloves, emerges from her side yard. She performs a comical look-left, look-right maneuver, like a spy in a bad 1960s movie. Seeing the coast is clear, she scurries over to the fence. She leans over, her face a mask of intense concentration, and disappears into the shrubbery for a moment. She reappears, a triumphant glint in her eye. In her hand are the shears. There's a distinct, visible snip as she severs the main control wire leading from the house to the valve assembly. The best part? After the snip, she stood up, dusted her hands on her khaki capris, and walked away with the unmistakable swagger of a jewel thief who just cracked the uncrackable safe at a Monte Carlo casino. She even did a little self-satisfied nod. It was a masterpiece of malice. I saved the video file to 3 separate cloud services and a thumb drive for good measure. I wasn't even angry. I was impressed. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it. The woman had the subtlety of a flashbang in a library. You had to almost admire it, almost. But this was a declaration of war. She had crossed the Rubicon. Or in this case, the perfectly manicured HOA-approved patch of fescue that separated our domains. She had finally escalated from passive-aggressive notes to active criminal sabotage. And she had no idea what she had just done. She thought she was disabling a sprinkler system. She had no idea she was actually arming a WMD, a wet mass destruction device. A slow, wide grin spread across my face. I felt a strange sense of calm, of serene purpose. The universe had presented me with a problem, and in the same stroke, an elegant, if somewhat damp, solution. I walked back to the living room, poured that fateful glass of iced tea, and picked up my tablet. She hadn't just cut a wire. She had thrown down the gauntlet. She had poked the bear. And she had forgotten that this particular bear had just finished installing nuclear-powered water pistols. The hum was the first sign. It started low, a deep thrumming that you felt in the soles of your feet before you heard it. It was the sound of the 5-horsepower, commercial-grade pump, nestled in its concrete bunker next to the subterranean water tank, waking from its slumber. The sound grew rapidly, from a hum to a growl, to a full-throated roar that vibrated the windows in their frames. Outside, Carol looked up from her self-satisfied reverie, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. What was that noise? Then came the second sign. All around the perimeter of my property, what had appeared to be innocuous landscape lights or decorative rocks suddenly popped open with a series of loud, pneumatic hiss-chunk sounds. From the earth rose the cannons. They weren't the flimsy plastic pop-ups you get at Home Depot. These were industrial-sized, solid brass and steel sprinkler heads, each the size of a fire hydrant's nozzle, gleaming menacingly in the afternoon sun. They rose with a sense of purpose, like the turrets on a battleship turning to face a threat. There was a half-second of pregnant silence. The world held its breath, and then with a sound that ripped the suburban tranquility to shreds, a deafening, concussive whoosh like a dozen fire engines opening their hoses at once, the system unleashed hell. This was not a gentle spray. This was not a mist. It was a high-pressure, high-volume curtain of water. A solid wall of liquid fired into the sky at an incredible velocity. The system wasn't designed to water my lawn. It was designed for perimeter defense. The streams were angled outwards, creating a dome of water over my property, with the brunt of the deluge crashing down just outside my lot line. Right onto Carol's house. I watched, mesmerized, from my window, the glass vibrating from the sheer acoustic power of it all. The scene outside had devolved into glorious, watery chaos. The first volley hit Carol's beige, stucco house like a tidal wave. It struck the wall with a force that sent a spray 100 feet into the air. Her meticulously clean windows were instantly blinded by a sheet of cascading water. Her front porch, the site of so many of her self-righteous pronouncements, was flooded in less than 3 seconds. Her Petunia of the Month garden was the first casualty. It was an extinction-level event. The force of the water didn't just bend the delicate flowers, it ripped them from the soil, vaporizing them into a churning vortex of mud, pink petals, and shattered dreams. One moment, an award-winning garden. The next, a roiling brown soup. Her little decorative white picket fence, the one she was so proud of, snapped like toothpicks and was washed away in the torrent. Her extensive collection of lawn gnomes, which she had arranged in a creepy tableau depicting what I could only guess was a gnome tea party, were swept up in the deluge. They bobbed away in the newly formed river running down the street, their frozen smiles looking like grimaces of pure terror. They were tiny, ceramic refugees fleeing a watery apocalypse. Carol herself let out a shriek that I'm fairly certain was audible in the next county. It was a sound of such pure, unadulterated rage and disbelief that it momentarily cut through the roar of the water cannons. She had been standing on her porch, and the wave hit her full on. She was drenched instantly, her perfectly coiffed, helmet-like hair plastered to her skull. She tried to scramble back into her house, but the water on her porch was already ankle-deep and rising fast, and she slipped, falling onto her hands and knees with a great splash. It was majestic, a symphony of destruction, like watching the Bellagio fountains on steroids and with a serious anger management problem. I took a slow sip of my iced tea. I saw Dave's prized plastic flamingo, which had been on his lawn across the street, get caught in the current and float by my window, its long neck bobbing gracefully in its final voyage. The sheer volume of water was biblical. I half expected to see a tiny ark appear, carrying 2 of every garden gnome. Oh, wait. There went one of Dave's. Make that one of every garden ornament. Doors and windows were flying open all up and down the cul-de-sac. My neighbors were emerging, their faces a perfect kaleidoscope of human emotion. There was horror. There was confusion. There was awe. And on the face of Bob from 3 doors down, a man who had once received a 3-page citation from Carol for having a basketball hoop that was aesthetically displeasing, there was a poorly concealed, ear-to-ear grin of pure joy. The street itself had vanished, replaced by a shallow, fast-moving river. The gutter system was completely overwhelmed. A river, born of my indignation, was now flowing through whispering pines. The system was programmed to run for a full 2 minutes. It felt like an eternity. It was the most glorious 2 minutes of my life. The shutdown was as sudden and dramatic as the activation. One moment, a roaring apocalypse. The next, an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of thousands of gallons of water gushing down the street and Carol's sputtering, incoherent shrieks of fury. My lawn was pristine, merely very, very wet. Carol's property, on the other hand, looked like it had been the site of a low-grade mudslide. The first sirens were a distant wail, but they grew closer with an urgency that suggested something more serious than a bylaw infraction. 10 minutes after the flood, 2 police cruisers, lights flashing, pulled up to the curb, their tires splashing through the ankle-deep water that still covered the road. 2 officers emerged. The first was older, with a thick mustache and the weary eyes of a man who had seen every flavor of human stupidity. His name tag read Miller. The second was younger, fitter, with a crisp uniform, and a face that was desperately trying to maintain a professional mask of stern neutrality. His name was Ramirez. Officer Miller surveyed the scene. The flooded street, my soggy but intact yard, Carol's disaster zone of a front lawn, and Carol herself, who looked like a drowned swamp creature, and sighed a sigh that contained the weight of 1,000 suburban disputes. I decided a proactive approach was best. I opened my front door and sauntered out, putting on my best face of calm, concerned citizenship. "Evening, officers. Everything okay?" Miller turned his gaze on me. It was a look that could curdle milk. "Sir," he said, his voice as dry as the surrounding desert, "are you aware that your house appears to have exploded with water?" "Officer, thank God you're here," I said, my voice full of feigned panic. "We had an emergency, a fire emergency." From her porch, Carol, dripping and covered in a fine sheen of mud and petal fragments, unleashed a new volley of shrieks. "Liar! He's a liar! There was no fire! He did this on purpose! He tried to drown me and my petunias! My award-winning petunias!" I held up my hands placatingly, a gesture of a reasonable man dealing with a hysterical neighbor. Whoa, easy there, Carol. Officers, my advanced wildfire detection system must have had a fault. It registered a critical temperature anomaly along my property line, right next to that dry canyon. I gestured vaguely towards the preserve. It's an incredibly sensitive system, designed to prevent disasters. It seems it triggered a false positive. A bit aggressive, I admit, but with the fire risk around here, better safe than sorry, right? Officer Ramirez, the younger cop, was now looking intently at Carol's former garden. A temperature anomaly, you say? He said, his voice carefully neutral. A very localized one? Extremely localized, I confirmed with a solemn nod. The sensor logs are very precise. High-risk heat source detected. Probably a piece of glass reflecting the sun or something. The system doesn't take chances. I can show you the data feed on my tablet if you'd like. I conveniently omitted the fact that I could manually input data triggers labeled Neighbor Annoyance Level Critical. This was the moment the conversation turned. With an air of great reluctance, as if it pained me to have to do this, I said, "You know, the system might have been acting up because someone was tampering with my property's wiring earlier. It's probably what caused the fault." Miller's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I hate to have to do this," I sighed, pulling out my phone. "But my security cameras caught something a little earlier." I played the video for them. I made sure to hold the phone so both officers could see the crystal clear 4K footage of Carol, the furtive glances, the lean, the glint of the shears, the decisive snip. For good measure, I did a little slow-mo replay of the triumphant smirk she gave right after the cut. The effect was immediate. Officer Miller looked from the phone to Carol, who had gone pale beneath the mud, then back to the phone. He looked at me, then up at the sky, as if asking a higher power why he had chosen this particular beat. Officer Ramirez suddenly became fascinated by a crack in the pavement at his feet. His shoulders, however, were shaking. He was braking. It was a beautiful, beautiful moment. The legal dynamic had just performed a screeching 180-degree turn. My system was a bit much, sure, but it was also a legally permitted, city-approved safety installation. Carol, on the other hand, had been caught on camera committing a crime, vandalism, destruction of property. "We'll need a copy of that video, sir," Miller said, his voice flat. Just as the officers were taking a sputtering, incoherent statement from Carol, a new vehicle arrived. A dusty work van with A-Team fire suppression emblazoned on the side screeched to a halt. Gus hopped out, his eyes wide as he took in the watery spectacle. He'd gotten an automated Client 1138, full system deployment alert on his phone, and, in his words, had to come see the show. He strode over to me, a massive grin splitting his face. "Holy Mother of God," he said, his voice full of reverence as he surveyed the watery chaos. "It's more beautiful than I ever imagined. It worked." "Like a dream, Gus," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Had a bit of a fire scare. Very, very localized." Gus nodded toward Carol's decimated yard. "Looks like you put out the fire, the house, the garden, and 3 gnomes. That's a full tank refill and system inspection fee, you know, per your contract." "Send the bill to the HOA," I said with a wink. "I'm logging it as an unscheduled but vital community safety demonstration." Gus let out a booming laugh that echoed down the cul-de-sac. He clapped me hard on the back. "Henderson," he roared, loud enough for the cops and half the neighborhood to hear, "you are my hero. My absolute water jet-wielding hero." Officer Miller just shook his head and went back to writing in his notepad. My victory was beginning to feel very, very complete. The email arrived the next evening. The subject line, written in a font that seemed to be vibrating with panic, was a masterpiece of corporate legalese. Urgent. Emergency Homeowners Association Board Meeting. Discussion regarding unprecedented hydrological event and review of bylaw. 7.4. Landscape and safety installations. I knew this was coming. The HOA, faced with a situation far outside its usual purview of beige paint and lawn maintenance, was in a full-blown meltdown. This meeting was going to be good. The community clubhouse was packed. It was standing room only, a turnout usually reserved for votes on raising fees. The air was thick with tension and the scent of cheap coffee. I spotted Carol in the front row, sitting ramrod straight next to the HOA president, a nervous man named Barry, whose primary qualification for the job seemed to be his ownership of many pastel-colored polo shirts. Carol was clutching a massive 3-inch binder with a printed label that read, "Evidence." She looked like a vengeful prosecutor ready to try a war criminal. I, by contrast, arrived a few minutes late, looking relaxed in jeans and a t-shirt. I took a seat in the back, giving a friendly nod to Dave, the gnome owner, who gave me a subtle thumbs up. He'd lost 3 gnomes in the flood, but had apparently gained a newfound sense of rebellious freedom. Barry called the meeting to order, his voice trembling slightly. "As you all know," he began, "we are here to discuss the, incident at the Henderson and, Carol's properties on Saturday." He gave the floor to Carol first. It was a mistake. She stood up and delivered a performance for the ages. It was a dramatic, tearful, and furious monologue that would have made a soap opera star proud. She painted me as a menace, a lunatic, a rogue agent who had purposefully deployed a weapon of mass destruction on her innocent petunias. She talked about her emotional distress, the damage to her property, the terror she felt. She demanded that I be fined into oblivion and forced by the HOA to dismantle my death machine immediately. "This isn't about safety," she concluded, her voice cracking with emotion as she pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is about a man who has no respect for our rules, for our community, for our way of life." The room was silent, save for a few sympathetic tisk-tisks from her cronies. She sat down, looking triumphant. Then Barry said, "Mr. Henderson, would you care to respond?" "I would," I said calmly. I walked to the small podium at the front of the room, carrying nothing but my tablet. I took a moment, looked out at the sea of curious and angry faces, and connected my tablet to the projector. "Good evening, neighbors," I began, my voice calm and even. "I know things got a little damp on Saturday, and I understand the concern. Carol has painted a rather vivid picture of me as a rogue supervillain, hell-bent on watering her petunias into oblivion. And while I admit the optics weren't great, let's look at the facts, shall we?" The first image that flashed up on the screen was a satellite map of our neighborhood. I'd highlighted our home's proximity to the fire-prone canyon. "This is where we live," I said simply, "right next to a tinderbox." The next slide was a collage of news headlines and terrifying photos from last summer's wildfire. The orange glow, the smoke-filled sky. And this is what happened last year. A little too close for comfort, I think we can all agree. Next, I put up a high-resolution scan of my city-issued permits. The official city seal was prominent. My system isn't an unapproved landscape modification, as the meeting agenda calls it. It's a city-approved, state-of-the-art wildfire suppression system, the very same kind used to protect vital infrastructure. It's here to protect my home, and by extension the homes of my immediate neighbors, from a very real and present danger. The mood in the room was shifting. You could feel it. The anger was being replaced by murmurs of consideration. Then, for the grand finale. The coup de grace. Now, the system was triggered by what it registered as a critical system fault, I explained, and I think I know why. I played the video. On the giant screen at the front of the room, for the entire community to see, was the footage from my security camera. Carol, the shears, the snip, the smug look of triumph. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a petunia drop. I let the video play on a loop a couple of times, the image of Carol's petty vandalism repeating over and over. "My system went off," I said, finally breaking the silence, "because a member of this community, a board member, in fact, was actively sabotaging my property's primary fire prevention features. Had that been a real fire, had a spark from the canyon landed in the dry grass that my disabled sprinklers were no longer watering, her actions could have cost us our homes. My system, as aggressive as it may seem, worked. The emergency in this case was one of our own. The room erupted. The spell was broken. People were talking all at once. Carol was sputtering, her face ashen. Barry the president looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Then Dave, the gnome owner, stood up. "You know," he said, his voice surprisingly loud, "my gnomes may be gone. They were good gnomes. But my roof is still here. And my wife is very attached to our roof. Maybe we should all be thanking him." Checkmate. In the end, it wasn't even a contest. You can't fight the law, and my system was legal. Carol's shears? Not so much. The HOA, facing the dual threats of a potential lawsuit from me for negligence, for allowing one of their board members to damage property, and a full-blown community mutiny folded faster than a cheap lawn chair at a windy picnic. The fallout was swift, silent, and deeply satisfying. Carol was quietly and unceremoniously forced to resign from all her HOA committee positions. The Petunia of the Month award was discreetly removed from the HOA website. Word also got around, thanks to the police report, that she was facing a misdemeanor vandalism charge. Her reign of beige terror was over. A week later, I received a check in the mail from the Whispering Pines HOA. It was for the exact amount of Gus's invoice for the water tank refill and system inspection. The memo line simply read, "Community safety expense." The best part? Over the next 2 weeks, I was approached by 4 different neighbors, including Dave, who all asked for Gus's contact information. Apparently, the idea of having your own personal flash flood on standby was catching on. A month after the Great Petunia washout, I was on my lawn, enjoying a perfect Saturday afternoon. The grass was a lush, vibrant green. My hydrangeas were flourishing, their blooms a perfect, unapproved, and glorious shade of blue. I'd installed new control wires for the regular sprinklers, this time encased in thick, tamper-proof steel conduit. I looked over at Carol's yard. It was still a work in progress. The lawn was a patchwork of new sod and bare dirt. The famous Petunia bed was just a barren rectangle of soil. She was outside, forlornly poking at the dirt with a trowel. She saw me looking. Our eyes met across the property line. She gave me a glare of pure, impotent fury, a look that could strip paint. Then she turned, dropped her trowel, and stormed back inside her beige house. They say good fences make good neighbors. I disagree. Sometimes you don't need a fence. You need a fully automated high-pressure perimeter defense system with a 500-gallon-per-minute flow rate. It's amazing how respectful people become when they know you can summon a typhoon on demand. It's the ultimate deterrent. And my property values, along with my peace and quiet, had never been higher.